During the era of the kings, Israel's sin grew so great that God used prophets to warn the Israelites that judgment was coming against them. The prophets told Israel that the Babylonian Empire would attack Israel, destroy Jerusalem, and exile the people. In 605 BC, the Babylonian Empire invaded Israel and began taking some of the Israelites as prisoners to their land. The prophets Daniel and Ezekiel were among those prisoners. Eventually, in 586 BC, Babylon destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple while taking many of the Israelites into exile. Even during this time of exile, God raised up prophets among the Israelites to remind them of their covenant with God and offer them hope. Most of this hope came in the form of the promised Messiah who would rescue Israel and be their king. In 539 BC, the Persian Empire became the new global superpower and conquered the Babylonian Empire. King Cyrus of Persia issued a decree allowing some of the Israelites to return to their land and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. The first group to return to Jerusalem was led by Zerubbabel, and they were tasked with rebuilding the temple. Unfortunately, the people were more focused on rebuilding their own houses than God's house. God raised up the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to help the people prioritize God and their covenant with Him. They also reminded the Israelites of the hope of the Messiah and His eventual arrival. Back in Persia, there is the account of the Israelite woman Esther. She was taken as the wife of King Xerxes. During her marriage to the king, an advisor of Xerxes named Haman convinced the king to issue a decree to kill every single Jew in the land. Despite the dangers to her own life, Esther trusted in God and stood up to Haman and King Xerxes. She asked the king to protect her people, and he agreed. Her account is a testimony to being faithful to God, as well as God's provision over His chosen people. A few years later, a scribe and priest named Ezra led another group of Israelite exiles back to Jerusalem. Where Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, Ezra's role was to restore worship at the temple. Ezra urged the Israelites to refrain from marrying people of other religions. He reinstituted the feasts of the law and the teaching of the law at the temple. His goal was to lead a spiritual revival in Israel. He was also greatly interested in rebuilding the walls around the city of Jerusalem, which was the project of one of his contemporaries named Nehemiah. Nehemiah was in Persia when he heard about Jerusalem's destroyed walls. He prayed and then asked the Persian king to allow him to return to Jerusalem to restore the city walls. He was given permission and traveled back to Jerusalem. Although he faced some opposition along the way, he was eventually successful in rebuilding the city walls. The prophet Malachi came onto the scene and found that the Israelites who were now occupying Jerusalem were just as depraved and evil as their ancestors before them. He began sharing a series of dialogues between God and the Israelites. God reminded Israel that He loves them and they are His covenant people, but they are still rebelling against Him. Malachi's message ends with a warning from God of His coming judgment and how those who do evil should fear this day of judgment, but those who honor His name should look forward to it. The final message is that the Messiah will arrive and usher in this great and dreadful day. This is the final message that Israel received from God until about 400 years later when Jesus arrived on earth. This era revealed many spiritual truths about God, such as His providence and faithfulness. The Israelites were sent into exile because of their sin and unfaithfulness to God. They rejected God once again, so God punished them through the invasion of the Babylonian Empire. Even in their helpless situation, God was still at work with the people of Israel. He raised up prophets who reminded the people of God's covenant with them. Eventually, God had mercy on Israel and used the Persian Empire to allow some Israelites to return to their homeland. In this moment, we see God's providence at work in how He uses the actions of the nations to bring about His purposes. God's faithfulness is also seen because, despite the Israelites' unfaithfulness to God, God remained faithful to Israel. This era of exile and restoration points to Jesus in a number of ways. The journey of the Israelites being exiled for their sin and needing restoration back to the Promised Land reflects the need for all humanity to be restored from their spiritual exile caused by sin. Only Jesus offers restoration from sin. This era is also full of prophets who reminded the people of the promised Messiah and future Davidic King. Prophets such as Zechariah, Daniel, and Malachi revealed details about how the Messiah would arrive, which Jesus later fulfilled. For example, Zechariah told the Israelites that their king would arrive on a donkey, which is how Jesus entered Jerusalem as Israel's king. This era was difficult for the Israelites, but they held on to the hope of the future Davidic king who would arrive.